The rejection on Mount Safa changed everything. The ruling elite of the Quraysh realized that the message of Islam was not a passing trend. It was a direct assault on their social hierarchy, their ancestral traditions, and their massive economic empire. Once the bribes were flatly refused, the leaders of Mecca unleashed a systematic campaign of persecution. But before they turned their wrath toward the vulnerable and the enslaved, they targeted the heart of the movement itself. They targeted the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Quraysh faced a difficult political dilemma. Because the Prophet was under the fierce tribal protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, they could not simply assassinate him without sparking a massive, bloody civil war within Mecca. Instead, they resorted to a brutal campaign of psychological warfare, public humiliation, and intense emotional abuse, designed to break his spirit and isolate him from society. The very streets he had walked for 40 years as Al-Amin suddenly became a gauntlet of hostility. The citizens who used to smile at him now looked away or spat as he passed. The psychological pressure inside his own neighborhood was relentless. One of his fiercest antagonists lived right next door, his own uncle, Abu Lahab, alongside the wife of Abu Lahab, Jamil. Jamil made it her daily mission to make the life of the Prophet unbearable. Every night, she would gather sharp thorns, twisted palm fibers, and filthy debris from the desert and carefully scatter them along the narrow pathway leading from the house of the Prophet. She hoped that when he stepped out in the darkness of the early morning to pray, the thorns would pierce his feet. Yet every morning, the Prophet would patiently clear the pathway without a word of retaliation, showing a level of forbearance that baffled his torturers. As the months passed and more people quietly accepted Islam, the desperation of the Quraysh turned into physical malice. They decided that if they couldn't kill him, they would desecrate his worship. The most famous of these trials occurred right in the courtyard of the Kaaba. The Prophet was prostrating in deep prayer, entirely absorbed in his devotion to the Creator. A group of the Quraysh elites, including the notorious Abu Jahl, were sitting nearby, watching him with pure hatred. Abu Jahl looked at his companions and mockingly asked, "Who among you will go to the slaughterhouse of such and such clan, fetch the fetid intestines and offal of a slaughtered camel, and dump it at the back of Muhammad, peace be upon him, while he is prostrating?" A man named Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt volunteered. He rushed to the shambles, gathered the heavy, filthy, blood-soaked inner organs of a camel, and brought them back to the Kaaba. He waited until the Prophet placed his forehead on the ground in ultimate humility before God. Then, with a cruel laugh, Uqba dumped the heavy, suffocating mass directly onto the back and neck of the Prophet. The weight and the sheer filth of the offal pinned the Prophet to the ground. He could not lift his head. The elites of Mecca erupted into hysterical laughter, mocking him openly, leaning on each other in amusement at the sight of the messenger of God trapped under animal waste. The Prophet remained patiently in prostration, refusing to break his prayer. Word of the humiliation rushed through the streets of Mecca until it reached his young daughter, Fatima, may God be pleased with her. She was only a young child at the time, but she ran to the Kaaba, her cheeks wet with tears, and courageously removed the heavy burden from the back of her father, peace be upon him, fiercely rebuking the grown men who stood around laughing. Only when the weight was lifted did the prophet raise his head. He did not curse them with anger. Instead, he raised his hands to the heavens and called upon God for justice, naming the oppressors one by one. The laughter instantly died in their throats. The Quraysh knew that the prayers of the wronged were answered, and a deep chill fell over the assembly. The hostility escalated from harassment to direct, life-threatening physical assaults. On another occasion near the Kaaba, Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt approached the Prophet while he was praying, took his own cloak, twisted it tightly into a makeshift rope, and threw it around the neck of the Prophet. Uqba pulled the cloth with all his strength, deliberately strangling the Prophet. The air left his lungs, and he was brought to his knees, on the verge of suffocating to death in broad daylight. Suddenly, Abu Bakr, may God be pleased with him, rushed into the courtyard. Seeing his closest friend being strangled, Abu Bakr threw himself into the fray, shoving Uqba away and shielding the Prophet with his own body. With tears streaming down his face, Abu Bakr, may God be pleased with him, cried out to the angry crowd, echoing the words of the believer from the historical trials of Moses. Would you kill a man merely because he says, "My Lord is God, Allah"? Beyond the physical attacks on his own person, the deepest pain the Prophet endured was witnessing the suffering of his followers. Because he lacked political power, he had to watch helplessly as his companions, may God be pleased with them, were broken by the Quraysh. Every single day, the ruling elites would drag the most vulnerable Muslims, like Bilal ibn Rabah, may God be pleased with him, and the family of Yasser, may God be pleased with them, out into the Ramda, the scorching, white-hot desert sand of Mecca at peak noon. They would place massive, burning rocks on their chests, demanding they renounce Muhammad and praise the stone idols of Lat and Uzza. The Prophet would walk past these fields of torture, his heart breaking, yet he could offer them no physical rescue. He could only offer them words of eternal hope. He would look into the eyes of Yasser, may God be pleased with him, his wife Sumayya, may God be pleased with her, and their son Ammar, may God be pleased with him, and call out through the heat, "Be patient, O family of Yasser, for indeed your destination is paradise." Sumayya would become the very first martyr of Islam, a loss that weighed immensely heavy on the Prophet. As the persecution reached its absolute peak, the Prophet delivered a spiritual blow to the Quraysh that shook the city's elite to their core. It happened during the sacred months, when the courtyard of the Kaaba was packed with thousands of pilgrims and the topmost leaders of Mecca. The Prophet stood up in the middle of the crowded sanctuary and began to loudly recite Surat an-Najm. The sheer linguistic power, the rhythm, and the divine majesty of the verses paralyzed the entire courtyard. Even his fiercest enemies, who had sworn to never listen to the Quran, stood frozen, completely captivated by the overwhelming eloquence of the words. The Prophet continued reciting, building up to the final, thunderous verse, "So prostrate to God and worship Him." As the Prophet dropped to the ground in prostration, a psychological miracle occurred. The spiritual weight in the air was so immense that the proud leaders of the Quraysh, including the elite who had mocked and tortured the Muslims, lost control of themselves. Moved by the absolute grandeur of the revelation, they instantly fell to their knees and prostrated right alongside the Prophet. For a single moment, the entire city of Mecca bowed to the one true God. When the leaders of the Quraysh stood back up, they realized what they had done in their trance, and their embarrassment instantly turned into furious, defensive rage. The Quraysh had thrown everything they had at the Prophet: mockery, bribes, psychological warfare, physical violence, and the torture of his dearest friends. May God be pleased with them. And they had utterly failed to break him. But as the message continued to spread, despite the cruelty, the leaders of Mecca grew truly desperate. They realized that isolating the Prophet individually was failing. The path of harassment was about to transform into something far more sinister: a total economic, social, and physical blockade that would push the Muslims to the absolute brink of starvation. The test of the Muslims' faith was underway,